You ever meet someone who looked completely ordinary, right before an entire military base remembered his name? The question drifted through the warm Carolina air just moments before everything changed. Marine Corps Base Lejeune was packed that Saturday afternoon. Families moved between static displays. Children climbed into mock cockpits. Retired Marines swapped stories beneath white event tents. The smell of grilled burgers mixed with the distant hum of generators and the steady rhythm of patriotic music playing through loudspeakers. It was supposed to be a day of celebration, a day where the past and present stood side by side. Near the center of the event sat a temporary VIP hospitality tent reserved for officers, invited guests, and visiting dignitaries. Uniformed Marines moved in and out with purpose, while volunteers arranged bottled water and refreshments along folding tables. Most people barely noticed the elderly man sitting quietly near the back. Thomas Walker sat alone in a metal folding chair, his weathered hands resting on the handle of a worn leather wallet. At 84 years old, he looked exactly like the kind of retiree people passed every day without a second glance. His faded tin jacket had clearly seen decades of use. His silver hair was neatly combed. His posture was relaxed but steady. He watched the activity around him with calm blue eyes that never seemed rushed by anything. Every few moments, a group of young Marines passed nearby without paying attention to him. Thomas appeared perfectly content with that. Invisible had become a comfortable place to live. Across the tent, Captain Ethan Brooks noticed him for the first time. Brooks was 31, ambitious, sharp, and proud of everything he had accomplished. His uniform was immaculate. His reputation was growing. His confidence filled every room before he entered it. When he spotted the old man sitting among invited personnel, his expression tightened immediately. He checked the guest roster on a tablet, then checked it again. Whatever he expected to find wasn't there. Brooks began walking toward the elderly man. Several younger Marines followed behind him, sensing entertainment before understanding the situation. The captain stopped directly in front of Thomas. The old veteran slowly lifted his eyes. "Sir," Brooks said loudly enough for nearby people to hear, "this section isn't part of the museum tour." A few chuckles came from behind him. Thomas simply looked at the captain. No irritation, no embarrassment, no reaction at all. The silence seemed to bother Brooks more than any argument could have. "I'm going to need to see some credentials," Brooks continued. "This area is restricted." Thomas nodded once and reached calmly into his jacket pocket. His movements were unhurried, deliberate. The captain watched with growing impatience as the old man carefully removed his wallet. Families passing outside the tent began glancing over. Conversations softened. People sensed tension the way sailors sense weather changing over open water. Thomas handed over his identification. Brooks studied it. Nothing remarkable. No special access. No obvious explanation. Just a name. Thomas Walker. The captain handed it back. "Mr. Walker," he said, folding his arms, "I think you've wandered into the wrong place." Thomas accepted the wallet and slipped it away. His expression never changed. Around them, the noise of the event continued. Children laughed somewhere beyond the tent. A helicopter demonstration was being announced over the speakers. But inside that small corner of the hospitality area, an entirely different atmosphere was beginning to form. Brooks leaned slightly closer. "Let me guess," he said with a smirk. "You used to be a Marine?" Several younger Marines grinned. Thomas looked up at him. Calm, patient, silent. And somehow that silence made the captain feel as though he was the one being evaluated. Captain Ethan Brooks held the old man's gaze for several long seconds. Around them, the atmosphere inside the hospitality tent continued to shift. More people were paying attention now, not because Thomas Walker had done anything unusual, but because he had done almost nothing at all. The captain expected irritation. He expected excuses. He expected an embarrassed apology followed by a quick exit. Instead, he found himself standing in front of a man whose calm seemed completely unaffected by rank, authority, or public pressure. Brooks forced a smile that carried more edge than humor. "You know," he said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Every reunion, every public event, somebody shows up with stories about the good old days." A few Marines behind him chuckled politely. Thomas remained seated. His blue eyes stayed steady. The old veteran glanced briefly toward the open side of the tent where sunlight shimmered across rows of parked vehicles. Families moved between displays. A distant American flag snapped sharply in the coastal breeze. Then his attention returned to the captain. "Were you a Marine?" Brooks asked again. Thomas nodded once. "A long time ago." The answer was simple. Too simple. Brooks seemed disappointed. "That is it?" he asked. "No stories? No famous missions? No tales about saving the Corps?" Several younger Marines laughed more openly this time. One of them folded his arms and leaned against a support pole, clearly enjoying the exchange. Thomas merely rested his hands together. "No," he said quietly. "Nothing like that." The response should have ended the conversation. Instead, it only encouraged Brooks. He was beginning to enjoy the audience. Every officer understood the temptation. A crowd naturally pulled attention toward whoever controlled the moment. Right now, Brooks believed that was him. "Well," he said, taking another step closer, "at least you picked a good seat. Most people work 20 years to get invited into this tent." Thomas looked around the hospitality area. White tablecloths, senior officers, distinguished guests. Then he gave a small nod. "Looks comfortable enough." More laughter followed. Brooks shook his head. "You know what amazes me?" he said. "Half the veterans I meet claim they were part of something legendary. Every one of them has a secret story nobody can verify." He paused. "Funny how that works." Thomas said nothing. The captain studied him carefully. There was no defensive reaction, no pride, no attempt to prove anything. The old man simply listened. Nearby, Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Reed had quietly entered the tent carrying a clipboard. He stopped when he noticed the growing crowd. Reed was a veteran of multiple deployments and possessed the kind of instincts developed through years of observing people. Something about the situation immediately felt wrong. He watched silently from several yards away. Brooks folded his hands behind his back. "Let me ask you something, Mr. Walker." His grin widened slightly. "If you were really one of those old legends everybody talks about, what was your call sign?" The question drew immediate interest. Several Marines exchanged amused looks. One shook his head and smirked. Another took a sip from a water bottle while waiting for the answer. Captain Brooks clearly expected either confusion or an exaggerated response. Instead, Thomas Walker slowly lifted his eyes toward him. The breeze whispered through the open tent. Somewhere outside, the loudspeaker announcer paused between events. For the briefest moment, the noise seemed to fade. Thomas looked directly at the captain and prepared to answer. Thomas Walker took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving Captain Ethan Brooks. The slight rustle of the tent flaps in the warm Carolina breeze seemed louder than usual, as if the world had quieted to watch. A few of the nearby Marines shifted in their seats, sensing something was about to happen, though none could have predicted what. The old man's voice, calm and measured, broke the silence. "Iron Viper," he said simply. The words were quiet, yet they cut through the hum of the event like a sharp whistle. Brooks blinked. He expected hesitation, an explanation, even a joke. Nothing came. The simplicity of the answer made the captain uneasy. Around them, the crowd sensed a subtle shift. Families paused mid-step. Volunteers stopped arranging chairs. Conversations halted, replaced by a collective curiosity that pulled all attention toward the two figures at the center of the tent. Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Reed, standing slightly behind, froze. His trained eye caught the reaction immediately. There was recognition, though no one else yet knew why. Marcus's mind raced through decades of records, old deployments, mission reports he had read or archived. Something about that call sign was familiar. Too familiar. He leaned subtly forward, careful not to interrupt, letting the words settle in his mind. Outside the tent, the wind picked up, tugging at the edges of the canvas roof. Sunlight caught the folds of Thomas's jacket and the faint gleam of his silver hair, emphasizing the calm certainty that seemed to radiate from him. Brooks shifted his weight, trying to regain control. He cleared his throat. "You are aware," he began, forcing a tone of authority, "that we have strict protocols for these events, correct?" Thomas Walker nodded once, slowly, deliberately. "Yes," he said, as if confirming the obvious. "No fear, no defensiveness, just quiet compliance." Brooks glanced at the Marines behind him. Their smirks had faded. The bravado of youth, built on assumption, began to falter as they realized that something in the old man's posture and gaze was not ordinary. Reed's hand twitched toward a tablet he carried, and with a subtle motion, he began to cross-reference the call sign with archived files. The machine beeped quietly as he typed, but Marcus's eyes never left the man in front of him. The more he searched, the more his pulse quickened. The historical records matched fragments of memory, missions, operations, deployments that were discussed only in hushed tones among a few select Marines. The weight of what he was uncovering pressed silently against the tent walls. Brooks noticed the change too, though he did not yet understand it fully. He could sense the tension, the subtle hesitation that crept into the posture of those around him. Even some of the younger Marines who had been confidently laughing minutes before now lowered their heads, sensing that the situation had shifted far beyond a casual exchange. The call sign had done its work. Thomas Walker did not need to explain, boast, or demonstrate. His mere mention of those two words had created a ripple through the hierarchy and the audience alike. Outside, the distant sound of a helicopter passing overhead punctuated the moment, a metallic reminder of the environment in which such legends were born. The sun glinted off the polished helmets of Marines standing guard at the perimeter, unnoticed as all eyes focused on the quiet veteran whose presence had suddenly transformed an ordinary day into something extraordinary. Brooks, for the first time, felt uncertainty prick at his confidence. He studied Thomas's face closely, searching for a sign, any sign, that would diminish the weight of the name he had just spoken. There was none, only calm, only unwavering composure. And that calm, combined with the recognition of Marcus Reed, began to rewrite the atmosphere within the tent. The hum of life resumed only slightly, the underlying tension never leaving. Every observer felt it, though few could name it. The old man had silently, effortlessly, taken control without movement, without force, and without a single raised voice. Brooks's jaw tightened. He realized that what he had assumed was harmless curiosity or playful provocation had just exposed him to the quiet authority of a man whose past commanded respect far beyond what uniform, rank, or title could convey. The veteran's answer had become the pivot around which the entire tent now subtly revolved, and the stage was set for the next move in a story that would not be forgotten. The words hung in the air, Iron Viper. The simplicity of the call sign belied its weight. Captain Ethan Brooks felt an unfamiliar tension tighten in his chest. He had expected something mundane, a playful anecdote, a half-hearted jest. Instead, the calm certainty in Thomas Walker's eyes suggested a history far larger than any uniform could convey. The surrounding Marines shifted subtly, sensing the shift though they could not yet identify its cause. Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Reed's eyes narrowed. He had seen countless veterans, heard countless tales, but something about the cadence of that name, the way it was spoken without fanfare, triggered a deep memory. Reed moved closer, letting his fingers hover over the tablet he carried, typing in the words cautiously, almost reverently, as though the act of entering the call sign into the system carried weight beyond any keyboard. Outside, a gentle breeze lifted the edges of the tent canvas. Sunlight cut across the faces of the gathered Marines, illuminating their curiosity and anticipation. Brooks leaned slightly forward, a half-smile on his face masking the first stirrings of unease. "And that is all?" he asked, trying to inject humor to regain control. Thomas Walker's gaze remained unbroken. He tilted his head ever so slightly, acknowledging the question without conceding to it. "That is enough," he said quietly. The phrasing was deliberate, measured, and entirely unhurried. Marcus Reed's eyes darted between the man and the screen of his tablet. The search results were startling. Files, archived documents, records of missions most officers only heard about in whispers, all confirming what the call sign represented. A legend, almost forgotten, yet real and undeniable. Brooks sensed it too. The air thickened with the weight of unspoken acknowledgement. The younger Marines shifted in their seats. Their confidence faltered. The casual bravado that had filled the tent moments before evaporated. Thomas Walker did not smile. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture. His mere presence, coupled with the recognition of the call sign, had reshaped the room. Outside, a distant helicopter passed overhead, a metallic hum underscoring the moment without breaking it. The sun glinted off polished helmets and brass insignias as Marines instinctively straightened, their attention drawn to the figure who had commanded respect through decades of quiet service. Brooks felt the shift keenly. He He was standing in front of a man whose authority had not been granted by rank or ceremony, but earned through years of skill, discipline, and action. Marcus Reed's finger hovered above the tablet, ready to initiate the next step in alerting the higher command. Around the tent, onlookers felt the subtle change, though they could not articulate it. Conversations died away, footsteps slowed, and every movement seemed to pause in anticipation. The hum of the event continued outside the tent, but within this small enclave, time seemed to bend around the presence of Thomas Walker. He was not loud. He did not demand attention. He simply existed, and the recognition of his call sign, the deep resonance of his history, reverberated silently, reshaping the perceptions of everyone in the tent. Brooks's jaw tightened as the realization sank in. He had been so certain, so assured, only to find himself confronted with the undeniable weight of a man who had lived a life far larger than any expectation or assumption. Every subtle gesture, every pause, every quiet word of Thomas Walker had already begun to command the attention and respect that his deeds alone would have earned. The words had barely settled when Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Reed's fingers moved deliberately across his tablet, entering the call sign again, watching as the system verified the entry and a single alert blinked on the screen. A faint but distinct hum of recognition spread through him, a reminder of briefings long ago and mission reports that few had lived to speak of. The younger Marines began to sense that tension, their confident laughter replaced by subtle glances toward the old man, whose blue eyes still held that steady calm. Captain Ethan Brooks felt the shift in the room like a physical pressure. He had expected bemusement or compliance, yet Thomas Walker's mere presence seemed to ripple through the crowd, drawing attention without a single word of explanation. Outside, sunlight glinted across the polished brass of rank insignias on the uniforms of officers standing near the tent, catching their attention but not diverting it. The breeze stirred the tent flaps, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of a helicopter faded and returned as if marking the rhythm of anticipation. Marcus Reed adjusted his stance, realizing the import of the moment, and discreetly initiated a secure message to the command center, including all necessary verification. The words, "Iron Viper," appeared repeatedly in his mind, a reminder that this veteran's past was tied to operations so critical that they had long been whispered about, almost erased from public memory. Brooks's confidence wavered, the smirk he had worn moments ago replaced with subtle tension in his jaw and shoulders. The younger Marines, sensing his unease, exchanged confused glances, trying to reconcile their assumptions with the presence of this calm, measured elder who seemed ordinary and yet somehow extraordinary. Thomas Walker sat back slightly, his hands folded on his lap, and allowed the stillness to expand around him, filling the tent with an almost tangible weight. The murmur of conversation had diminished entirely, replaced with quiet observation, the collective sense that something significant was unfolding. Every movement outside the immediate circle slowed, as if the crowd subconsciously recognized that the narrative they were witnessing had shifted beyond ordinary ceremony. Captain Brooks took a careful step closer, voice measured but laced with curiosity. "You do understand what that call sign means, do you not?" he asked. Thomas Walker's eyes met his without a flicker of hesitation. "I do," he said softly, the words deliberate. The response was not boastful. It did not invite further questioning, yet it carried all the weight of acknowledgement. Marcus Reed's fingers paused, hovering above the tablet, as the confirmation reached him. The alerting system displayed the veteran's file, and each line he read reinforced the legend behind the call sign. A mission deemed improbable, a feat recorded in restricted logs, a survival and leadership remembered only by the few who had been present. The energy in the tent shifted once more, this time heavier, denser. Brooks felt it pressing at the edges of his awareness, a hum of anticipation that had nothing to do with ceremony and everything to do with legacy. Even the smallest gestures became loaded. The tilt of a head, the subtle nod of Thomas Walker, the shifting posture of Marines who had been observing quietly. Outside, the day proceeded with its scheduled events, but within the tent, time seemed to bend around the presence of the veteran. Each observer felt the significance, the silent authority emanating from Thomas Walker, and Brooks recognized that the balance of the room had irreversibly changed. The quiet of the tent was no longer merely absence of sound. It was presence, respect, and the subtle acknowledgement of a history that demanded attention without words. The stage was set, the pieces in motion, and every mind in the tent was now acutely aware that this moment and this veteran were far beyond ordinary experience. Several miles away from the hospitality tent, inside a secure administration building near the center of the base, a routine staff meeting was underway. Large screens displayed schedules, logistics updates, and preparations for upcoming training exercises. Officers reviewed reports while support staff moved quietly around the room. Everything followed the predictable rhythm of a normal Saturday operation. Then a notification appeared. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. A single priority flag surfaced on a secure monitor connected to archived personnel records. The duty officer glanced at it casually at first. Then he looked again. His expression changed immediately. The notification contained only a few words. Legacy record accessed. Call sign reference detected. Iron Viper. The officer straightened in his chair. He had never personally met the man associated with that designation, but he recognized the significance of what he was seeing. Certain names faded with time. Others became stories. A very small number became part of institutional memory. He reached for a phone. Back inside the hospitality tent, Thomas Walker remained seated exactly as before. Nothing about him suggested the quiet chain reaction unfolding across the base. His jacket was still slightly faded. His leather wallet still rested in his lap. To anyone arriving at that exact moment, he would have looked like nothing more than an elderly guest attending a public event. Yet the atmosphere surrounding him had become noticeably different. Captain Ethan Brooks sensed it most of all. Every instinct told him he had lost control of the interaction, but he could not identify exactly when it had happened. The crowd had not grown larger, yet it felt denser. Conversations nearby remained subdued. Marines who had originally been smiling now watched silently. Even those who knew nothing about the call sign could feel its effect. Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Reed received a secure response on his tablet. He read the first line and felt a chill run through him despite the warm afternoon air. The file was not classified. It was something stranger. It was protected by legacy authorization protocols rarely used anymore. Reed continued reading. The operation summary was brief. Most of the details had been intentionally restricted decades earlier. But one sentence remained visible. It was enough. Recognition awarded by Joint Command Authority. Exceptional leadership under extraordinary circumstances. Historical designation retained. Reed slowly lowered the tablet. He looked at Thomas Walker with entirely different eyes now. The old veteran noticed the glance, but offered no reaction. He had seen that look before. Not admiration. Not fear. Understanding. Outside, a flag snapped sharply in the breeze. The sound carried through the opening of the tent. Sunlight shifted across the concrete walkways beyond, casting long shadows beneath parked vehicles and display equipment. Families continued enjoying the event, unaware that a quiet piece of Marine Corps history had just resurfaced among them. Reed took several careful steps away from the crowd and placed a call. The officer on the other end answered immediately. Reed identified himself and provided the call sign. There was silence. Then a single question. "Are you absolutely certain?" Reed glanced toward Thomas Walker. The old veteran was speaking softly to a child who had wandered near the seating area, answering a question about an aircraft display with patient kindness. Nothing about the interaction resembled the image people associated with legends. That was precisely why it mattered. "Yes, sir," Reed answered. "I am certain." The line went quiet again. Longer this time. Finally, the officer spoke. "Do not let him leave." Reed stared at the phone after the call ended. The words echoed in his mind. Not because they sounded urgent, because they sounded respectful. Back near the center of the tent, Captain Brooks folded his arms and attempted to recover some measure of authority. Yet even he could sense that something larger than rank had entered the conversation. Somewhere beyond the visible crowd, beyond the event's schedule and public ceremonies, a door had quietly opened, and people at the highest levels of the base had just started walking toward it. Lieutenant General Robert Kane moved briskly through the wide concrete corridors of Marine Corps Base Lejeune, the quiet authority in his steps drawing immediate attention from officers and staff alike. He had received the alert, a call sign flagged through secure channels, Iron Viper. The words alone carried weight that demanded action. The general did not speak as he passed. He did not scan the room for fanfare. Instead, each stride was measured, confident, and purposeful, slicing through the ordinary flow of a Saturday routine with an invisible force that made everyone step aside without a word. Back in the hospitality tent, Captain Ethan Brooks felt the shift before it even became visible. The subtle change in atmosphere, a tightening of the collective awareness among Marines, suggested that someone important was approaching. Thomas Walker remained seated, calm, hands resting lightly on his wallet. Not a single gesture betrayed anticipation, yet the old veteran's presence seemed to resonate further with every passing second. The crowd grew still, sensing an invisible tension in the air, a weight that had nothing to do with age, rank, or ceremony, but everything to do with history. Outside, the sunlight reflected off polished brass insignias on the uniforms of passing officers, momentarily catching the attention of several spectators who followed the gleam with their eyes. The hum of the distant helicopter and the murmur of families faded into the background as Lieutenant General Kane entered the tent through the open flap. There was no announcement, no formal introduction, only the quiet sound of his boots on the polished floor and the subtle scent of his presence that seemed to expand the space around him. The general's eyes locked on Thomas Walker, reading the calm composure, noting the quiet dignity, the unspoken authority that radiated from a man who had earned legend without ever demanding recognition. Captain Brooks straightened instinctively, trying to maintain composure, but the effect was immediate. Every muscle in his body tightened. The young officers and Marines present instinctively straightened as well, the gravity of the general's arrival unmistakable. Lieutenant General Kane approached slowly, deliberate in his pace, each step commanding silent acknowledgement. As he drew near, Thomas Walker lifted his gaze to meet the general's eyes, an almost imperceptible nod acknowledging recognition of shared history, understanding, and the weight of deeds done long ago. The general paused in front of him, a deep breath, and then rendered a precise, military salute. The motion was fluid, deliberate, carrying with it years of command and unspoken respect. Thomas Walker returned the salute, simple and exact, a gesture sufficient to communicate acknowledgement without words. The crowd held its collective breath. The tent was silent, the event around them fading into insignificance. Captain Brooks exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest a tangible reminder of the hierarchy beyond rank, the authority earned through decades of action, and the quiet persistence of competence that commands attention without demand. The general stepped back slightly, voice steady, deep, and calm. Every Marine standing here serves in the shadow of what this man has done, he said, the words carrying through the tent with clarity, leaving no doubt of their weight. Thomas Walker remained seated, calm as ever, his blue eyes meeting those of the general, acknowledging recognition and returning respect with equal measure. Captain Brooks remained frozen, understanding finally, without a word, that the ordinary assumptions he had brought to this moment were entirely inadequate in the presence of legacy, experience, and the quiet power of Iron Viper. The tent seemed suspended in time as Lieutenant General Robert Kane drew closer, the sound of his boots soft but unmistakable, echoing slightly across the polished concrete beneath the canvas flaps. Every eye turned, some with curiosity, others with instinctive respect for a figure who required no introduction. Captain Ethan Brooks felt a cold awareness settle over him, the realization that he was no longer directing the attention of the room, but merely witnessing it shift toward a force far older, far steadier, and far more authoritative than himself. Thomas Walker remained seated, calm as ever, the lines of his face relaxed, his hands resting lightly on his folded wallet. Yet even in stillness, the air around him seemed charged, carrying the quiet authority of decades of service, experience, and actions that had long outlasted memory in official reports. The general's eyes scanned the space briefly, noting the subtle posture changes of the officers and Marines, the collective straightening of shoulders and attentive stances that had nothing to do with ceremony and everything to do with instinctive recognition of legacy. Without a word, Kane moved directly toward the veteran, his presence commanding a silent acknowledgement that rippled across the assembled crowd. Families and volunteers, though unfamiliar with the situation, sensed a shift in weight and quieted instinctively. Captain Brooks tried to mask his own uncertainty, adjusting the creases of his uniform, tightening the line of his jaw, but the subtle gravity of the general's approach left him rigid, unable to reclaim the narrative he had thought he controlled. The distance between Kane and Walker closed with deliberate pace, measured, each step signaling focus, discipline, and an unspoken acknowledgement of history. When Kane paused before the veteran, the hum of the tent seemed to vanish entirely. He offered a single, precise salute, fluid and exact, conveying respect without the need for words, a gesture learned over a lifetime of command and observation. Thomas Walker returned it simply, deliberately, matching the gesture with no flourish, only acknowledgement. Around them, the audience remained motionless, aware of the gravity without comprehension, each observer caught in the subtle choreography of honor and recognition. Brooks's eyes followed the interaction closely, the weight of it pressing against his expectations. He felt the old assumptions crumble, the authority he had presumed inherent in his rank overshadowed by the tangible presence of someone whose reputation had been forged through quiet mastery and historical significance. The general's voice finally cut through the stillness, low and controlled, carrying an unmistakable tone of recognition and respect. "Every Marine standing here serves in the shadow of what this man has done," Kane said, the words simple but resonant, echoing in the tent like a declaration of legacy. Thomas Walker remained seated, his gaze steady, acknowledging the statement with the quiet dignity of one who has lived through the deeds rather than spoken of them. Captain Brooks exhaled slowly, a mixture of awe and disbelief, as the understanding sank in. Around them, the event continued externally, children's laughter and distant announcements blending with the heat of the afternoon sun, but inside the tent, the narrative had shifted irrevocably. The veteran had become the pivot, the gravity around which every subtle movement now turned, and Lieutenant General Kane's presence only amplified the silent command he already held over the space. Every person present, from junior Marines to attending officers, felt the invisible line of authority stretch across the tent, unbroken, tangible, and utterly compelling. The tent remained still, the subtle shift in atmosphere almost tangible as Lieutenant General Robert Kane's presence anchored the room. Thomas Walker's calm gaze held steady on the general, acknowledging an unspoken recognition of history, of missions and moments long preserved in memory and classified records alike. Captain Ethan Brooks stood frozen, the weight of the realization pressing against his uniformed chest, as if every expectation he had about authority and control had been quietly rewritten by the presence of experience, legacy, and quiet mastery. Around them, the younger Marines straightened instinctively, their earlier laughter replaced by restrained attention, subtle glances, and the recognition that the hierarchy of respect in this room transcended rank. Outside, the sunlight shifted, casting long, warm beams across the tents and walkways, illuminating the glint of badges, the polished sheen of brass insignias, and the focused faces of those witnessing the subtle, yet profound, moment unfolding. Lieutenant General Kane's voice, low and precise, broke the silence. "Sir, we teach every Marine tactics, leadership, and discipline," he said, each word deliberate, reverberating without raising volume. "But we teach legends through example, and today, you remind us of why those lessons endure." The words were simple, yet absolute, echoing in the space like a measured cadence, demanding attention without force. Thomas Walker acknowledged with a slight nod, his expression unchanged, yet imbued with the gravity of acknowledgement, a silent affirmation of deeds long completed and recognized without the need for ceremony. Captain Brooks exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders relaxing imperceptibly, replaced by a dawning comprehension that the ordinary assumptions he had brought into this moment were inadequate. He had assumed visibility equated to authority, knowledge equaled power, and confidence meant control. Instead, he now understood that the veteran's presence alone, coupled with the call sign and the general's recognition, had quietly shifted the balance. Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Reed, standing slightly behind, observed the scene with careful awareness, noting the measured reactions of the assembled Marines and staff. His eyes flicked to the secure tablet in his hands, confirming the verification of the call sign, the acknowledgement of historical operations, and the legacy designation that had triggered this chain of events. Around the edges of the tent, families continued to enjoy the open house, the distant hum of conversations, children's laughter, and helicopter announcements blending with the afternoon sun. Yet within the tent, a quiet respect had settled, unspoken, unforced, pervasive. The veteran had not raised his voice, gestured with drama, or demanded attention. He had existed in stillness, and that stillness had drawn recognition, respect, and acknowledgement that no words could enhance. Captain Brooks glanced at the veteran one last time, noting the calm certainty, the unwavering presence, and the subtle authority carried in every gesture and pause. Every observer within the tent felt it, even those unfamiliar with the call sign or history. The energy of the moment was quiet but profound, a powerful affirmation that legacy, experience, and competence often command more attention than ceremony, more respect than rank, and more authority than words. Thomas Walker's presence had become the pivot around which perception, respect, and recognition now rotated, leaving a silence that spoke volumes, a quiet moral resonating through the assembled Marines and officers. Some names are remembered not for being loud, but because their deeds ensured others could tell the story.